Welcome, everyone, to Emmett's weekly webinar featuring Lowenthal Marcus discussing how California ethnic studies curriculum has been infiltrated by some pretty awful anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist educators, and how those studies harm Israel and the Jewish people. Emmett, as you all know, is a 501c3. We are a unabashedly pro-Israel, pro-America think tank based in Washington, D.C. We work daily on the Hill with Congress members and their staffers to ensure policy that protects both Americans and Jewish Americans and Israelis, and brings truth to the narrative about Israel and the Middle East. We do all of our work with your support, and we thank you all for your support and ask you to kindly visit emmettonline.org to consider making a financial donation and learn more about the work that we do. Today, our discussion with Lori is a critically important one. Lori is a lawyer in private practice, but she's also the legal director of the Deborah Project, a public interest law firm that represents people who are discriminated against in educational settings because they are Jewish and/or pro-Israel. In the case filed by the Deborah Project in May of 2020 in federal court in Los Angeles, the firm seeks to stop a consortium of ideologically driven educators and its allies who are proselytizing and training LA school district teachers to use teaching materials that are virulently hostile to the Jewish state. The materials include descriptions as if fact of Israel as an illegitimate state, one founded on ethnic cleansing, committed to genocide, and maintained as an apartheid state. Lori will go into more detail on all of that. Lori began her legal career in the late 1980s as a litigator in a large national law firm. Her practice consisted primarily of representing media clients in First Amendment cases. She graduated from Harvard Law School, has 2 masters from Bryn Mawr College, and received her BA from Brandeis University. While raising her 4 children, Lori founded an international Zionist organization, Z Street. When the IRS under the Obama administration pushed aside Z Street's application for tax-exempt status, she successfully sued the IRS for viewpoint discrimination. During and following the 7 years of the Z Street litigation, Lori spent nearly a dozen years as a journalist covering Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish diaspora, particularly the rising tide of anti-Semitism on U.S. college campuses. I just want to add that I've known Lori for a very long time. She's one of the most ardent Zionist and pro-Israel activists out there, and it's just a pleasure to be talking with you today, Lori. The webinar today will be recorded, and you will be able to access it after today. If you have any questions for Lori, we will get to those towards the end of the program, and you can put them in the Q&A function at the bottom. Please don't use the chat because we can't monitor both of those for questions, so be sure to put your questions in the Q&A. Welcome, Lori. We have a lot to unpack on the issue that we're going to be discussing today, and in particular of ethnic studies curricula. But I'd like to start by, sort of doing a ethnic studies 101 and asking you to explain to our audience what exactly ethnic studies is. Where did it originate? What is it exactly in terms of what students are being taught? And why is it that Governor Newsom of California has required that all high school students must take an ethnic studies class in order to graduate?
Okay, there I am. Ethnic studies started in the late 60s when the college campuses were a broil dissimilar to the way they are now. People were protesting the Vietnam War, US involvement there. But they didn't really turn on each other as they are now. What the Third World Liberation Movement and the Black Panthers were really the crux of the protesters. A huge protest took place, a strike at San Francisco State University. What they were demanding is more courses that reflected their own narrative. They felt that Mexican Americans, Black Americans, Chicanos, Hispanics had been erased from American history, and they were adamant that the university administration be responsive to their demands. I made a long list of demands, including reinstating a graduate student instructor who had stated in a classroom that we, meaning all students of color, are slaves and we have to kill all the slave masters. So he was removed, and that was a demand that he be reinstated. And so there was a lot of turmoil. The strike went on for an entire school year. It spread to Berkeley the following year. And ultimately, what the administration decided to do, the way a resolution was reached, was to create first courses, then department, and ultimately a college of ethnic studies. Now, the groups that were demanding their narrative be heard were Black Americans, Hispanic Chicanic Americans, Asian American Pacific Islanders, and Indigenous Native Americans. So those were the four groups whose voices were the loudest. And it really did start in California. It started even earlier on at a much lower level with Mexican American studies being demanded. So that was the result of a really enormous outcry on the campuses. What happened next is through the years, the intervening years, ethnic studies kind of took on not only a life of its own, but a science of its own, so that people who took the courses and became ethnic studies experts concretized what ethnic studies is. And so their demand is that it's only those four groups, those four, what they refer to as racialized groups. Nobody else is going to be studied. A lot of people, I'm sure you know, Lori and others, when you hear the words ethnic studies, well, probably not you because you know better, but you would think, okay, it's about celebrating Native cultures or other cultures, minority cultures, but that's not really what it is. It became this very Marxist-Leninist, anti-American, anti-capitalist, anti-white, anti-everything, every group that you can imagine, except for these marginalized, what they believed were marginalized groups. So more and more people are being educated in this departments and in this college of ethnic studies. And so just as you have to have a certain number of math classes and science classes and English classes to graduate from high school, the demand began to be made that ethnic studies also be a high school graduation requirement. So that's kind of the lead up to where this started. I don't know if you want me to stop now and ask questions or keep going.
So it seems obvious to me that ethnic studies is more of a propaganda tool than an educational curriculum. But there are teachers all over the country who interject, their own biases into classrooms. So, what's happening in California, and yes, this is a good segue to start talking about your lawsuit. And so in particular, the focus is on the Los Angeles public schools that led to your lawsuit. So can you tell us exactly what the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Consortium is? Who makes up that consortium? And do we know where they get their funding? Because I think that's important. And just for the audience, I'm going to put in 2 links to articles that Lori has written. One was in the Wall Street Journal, and the other, I think, was originally in the LA Times and reprinted in the Jewish Journal. So those links I'll put in the chat, and you can save those to read at a later date. But Lori, love to have you fill us in on all of that right now.
Okay, so I'm going to still have to there's one little gap between the two, and I'll explain. The state legislature in California agreed that we need to have ethnic studies as a graduation requirement. And it was just a couple of words in a state law, the education law of California, making this new requirement and establishing a date by which it had to happen. And all high school graduates had to have at least one course in order to graduate. They could have more. While this bill and then law was going through passage, a number of experts in ethnic studies were gathered to draft a model curriculum for the state. Now, the model curriculum is just that, a model. It's not required that every school district use what's in that model curriculum, but it is seen as this is the exemplar. However, when the curriculum was unveiled and people saw what these ethnic studies experts had put in, there was a huge outcry, primarily from the Jewish community, but not only the Jewish community. Armenians and Sikhs and some others were also very upset. But the representation of Jews in the Jewish state was extremely problematic, and I'm using a euphemism. I mean, it was awful, really, really bad. So the governor, to his credit, said, we're not going to have this. We're sending it back to the drawing board. The people who had been gathered to create this model curriculum, thank you very much, but we're going to be using something else. And a new curriculum was drafted. And that is what is referred to as the actual model curriculum. And that's when the law was passed. And now we get to Liberated. The educators, the experts who had been, whose mission had been denied, gathered together and created a consortium. The Liberated, that means liberated in terms of authentic, in terms of liberatory teaching. It's a phrase that's used for things that they like and that traditional educators are uncomfortable with. But it is an ethnic studies consortium of educators. And unfortunately, they're the only game in town. They're the one source for professional ethnic studies educators. And so the school districts are in a bit of a bind. They have to offer these courses. I mean, it's staggered over time, but eventually by 2030, they'll have to have, every school will have to have, at least a course, if not more. So these liberated ethnic studies folks have this model curriculum. Guess what? They already had it. It's the one that was rejected by the people of California and the government of California. The liberated folks, their view is, and this is what I alluded to earlier, it's a science. Ethnic studies is what they say it is, not, by the way, what the government of California says it is. So the liberated folks, the ones we sued, are the ones who say, no, that's not authentic. Only what we have is actual ethnic studies, is legitimate ethnic studies, and it is about decolonizing, being anti-racist, and global liberation. That's what they're about, and that's what they're teaching. And they have institutes right now. I don't know why they call them institutes. They're like seminars or sessions for educators in which teachers, public school teachers, are taking courses and learning how to teach this liberated ethnic studies material. So we brought the lawsuit against the consortium, against the LA Teachers Union, which is very, very supportive of the of this liberated curriculum. The person who is a teacher in a Los Angeles public school and the head of the consortium and the head of the teachers union, Cecily Meyer Cruz, and another, Teresa Montano, who is, she teaches at Northridge, at California University, State University, and she's an expert. She is adamant about what ethnic studies is and is not. And they're so convinced that what they're saying is true and right. And the law be damned, we are going to do this, even though Governor Newsom said in passing the legislation, you school districts can create your own curriculum, but you cannot use the discriminatory bias material that was in the draft. But that's what's happening. And I can tell you how I know it's happening, but maybe you want to jump in.
Well, what I would love for you to do, in addition to telling us how you know about this, is to share some of what's being taught with us, because I think our audience really needs to hear how just horrific and dangerous and insightful, it's incitement to violence, if you ask me, against Jews. And we could also, I think, spend an entire webinar discussing why anti-Zionism, because a lot of this is anti-Zionism as well as just being flat out anti-Semitic. But anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. So can you briefly explain why? I think that maybe some of these teachers are trying to make a distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. But why is this? What are they teaching, and why is it so dangerous? And doesn't California have anti-BDS or other civil rights laws that could be applied in this case to prevent this?
Well, California not only has the BDS law, you're correct, but and it could potentially apply in this situation if there is a contract. The consortium is going district to district selling their services. So potentially, if there's a contract for over $100,000, then the BDS law could kick in and the consortium could be required to say that they don't support BDS, which would not happen. But beyond that, there's already a law in California that, well, there's several different levels, but there is a law that says you cannot discriminate on the basis of race, religion, etc. So it's a violative of that. When the governor passed the legislation, as I said, he already said this material is not to be part of the curriculum, even if you develop your own. So we have that. It violates Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. That's fairness to all, equal opportunity and equal rights, non-discrimination in educational settings. And so it violates a whole host of laws. What they say is that, and Laura, you and I know this from years of paying attention to anti-Israel activism. The reference is to Palestine, historic Palestine. There's no explanation about what constituted historic Palestine, that it was not a country, it was never sovereign, it was never a people, they never had a monetary system, etc. It is the Jews came in as an expression of Western colonialism. They threw out the native indigenous Palestinian people. The settlers, in the definition in one of the lesson plans, they have settlers are Jews who take over the land and homes of Palestinians. They define their definition, Israel as an apartheid state. They compare the Palestinians with indigenous Americans, and that's where they get into these lesson plans, and they compare borders, between Mexico and the United States, and between the territories and Green Line Israel. They talk about the refusal to the stealing of water by Israel. I mean, so it's negative after negative after negative. They also talk about ethnic cleansing and genocide as if fact. So that's what the Jewish state is committing. And these are lesson plans for kids. Now, these courses they're pre-K to 12th grade. So we're going to have kids coming through the California public school systems. By the time they get to college, they don't need to be persuaded. They will be the leaders already of why Israel is a demonic state and has no right to exist, which is what is expressed in the materials that the instructors are getting, and then they're passing it on to our school children. So it's extremely negative. Here's another thing that's bizarre about it. When I said before that there are these 4 racialized groups that constitute ethnic studies, where do you get the Palestinians from? Well, believe it or not, They're in Asian American and Pacific Islanders. That's weird. But not only that, but the people who live in that same area, the Jews, they're not included. In fact, the liberated folks had a fit when the government, the California government, said, well, you should include Jewish studies in there. That's ridiculous, was their response. There is no basis for including the Middle Eastern Jews with the Palestinians as indigenous people in the Middle East. They also refer to all Israel and Israelis and Jews as white. And we know that that is a pejorative term. They are the oppressors, even though, as we know, more than half of Israelis are technically people of color. Most of them, of those people of color, have lived in that area in North Africa, the Middle East, or the B'nai Menashe from India. They're people with skin that is darker than white people's skin, but it's a way of demonizing all Israelis. Or they can't be people of color because then they wouldn't be privileged. Well, they are, and it's absurd and it's incorrect. And these are educators who are educating children with these ridiculous, but not ridiculous, dangerous fantasies, and really just these gymnastics to try and fit in what you want and leave out what you don't want. And in the interim, creating a very dangerous situation. The consortium puts out material that says, don't worry, the Zionist groups like the federations and the JCRCs and other mainstream, the ADL, the Zionist groups, they'll tell you that it's anti-Semitic. That's a trick. It's not anti-Semitic to teach critically about Israel. Zionism and Judaism are distinct. So don't you worry, you're not being anti-Semitic, even if that's what they tell you. So they decide what is and is not Judaism. They decide what is and is not anti-Semitism. And they're getting away with it. So that's why we brought the lawsuit. We had first heard that there was a BDS resolution working its way through the union in Los Angeles. That's how we turned our sights to Los Angeles. But ultimately, it was withdrawn, the resolution, as it made its way up to the highest level of the union to take a vote. They withdrew it at the last minute. I assume, but don't know for sure, that there was some deal made. That's withdrawn, and perhaps the deal was, the other side was, you do what you want below the radar, and we're not going to do anything about it, because they're getting away with it. And everyone, by everyone, I mean the professional Jewish organizations and the legislators, are saying, oh, well, it's not ripe now to bring a lawsuit. There's no actual liberated ethnic studies in the classroom. Well, we know that there is, because they say it. These liberated folks say it flat out. We will not teach what the government said is ethnic studies. It's not authentic. Dilution is not the solution. And it's our turn, they say. It's our turn to have the stories about us, our narratives. And we don't want to have to worry about offending other groups, because this is a time for our stories. So it's a problem.
It's all very insidious and extremely dangerous, as you point out. You brought up a couple other points that we're going to get to. But I mean, in addition to being Emmett's New York chapter president and board member, I'm also the vice president and treasurer and board member of an organization called Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, which is focused on bringing truth to the teaching of Middle East studies on college campuses and supporting faculty members who run into difficulties for doing just that. So while there's numerous groups that focus on supporting Jewish students, SPME recognizes that while students come and go, teachers are there for the long haul. And you've made it so clear how dangerous teachers are, Lori. Given how easy it is, though, for teachers to get tenure and how difficult it is to fire them, even if they use their classrooms as platforms to teach lies and incite hate. I'm thrilled that the Deborah Project and you have filed this lawsuit, but what's the relief that you're seeking? And will it be enough to send a message across the country that these teachings must stop? While injunctions and full disclosures are important to achieve, it seems to me there also must be a punishing price to pay as a future deterrent for both the LA school district as well as schools across the country. I don't know if a loss of federal funds, monetary fines, government oversight, which I hate because that's just big government interfering. It seems to me that this isn't going to end unless there's a steep price to pay. And I think of the Princeton professor, the Jewish Princeton professor, who was just fired. He was tenured for decades, but he was fired, they claim, based on a relationship he had with a student 15 years ago. So
which he had already been punished.
Right. So double jeopardy on top of that. But it seems to me that teachers, who are tenured, if you want to get rid of them for not being woke or for not being, anti-Israel enough, you can. What do we do here? What are your remedies that you're seeking, and will that be enough?
Well, the remedies we're seeking are the only remedies really legally available to us at this point. We are seeking essentially compliance with the law, with California law and federal law. So in order to institute new curricular materials, there have to be public hearings. Well, they're not having public hearings. They're pretending that they're not having this material. So we are demanding transparency, and we're demanding that they remove this harmful, insightful material and not teach it in schools, because that is also not permitted. Can you imagine if a teacher decided to say in a classroom that, homosexuality is a mental illness? It would, before the day was out, the person would be called on the carpet, and rightly so. That you don't have, I'm not sure everybody knows this, public school teachers do not have a First Amendment right in the classroom because they are representing the government. So you can say whatever you want in your own home, out on the street, in your organizations, whatever, but you cannot teach material that is discriminatory, that is biased in a public school classroom. So here's a few suggestions that I have to make this lawsuit and all the claims of the parents and the teachers have some teeth. One, I've heard over and over again from teachers that no one comes in the classroom. No one is paying any attention. There's no supervision. There has to be. There are layers of administrators in schools, and I understand how difficult it is to be a school teacher and a school administrator. This is part of the job. You need to make sure that the teachers are teaching material that our children will benefit from, will grow up to be productive members of society, and not hateful material. So there have to be spot checks. But here's another thing that has to happen. Parents need to step up and ask the questions, because, until we had this possible BDS resolution, a lot of parents didn't know what was happening in the schools. And they started asking, well, what are you hearing? And they started hearing about really unsettling information that was being propagated in the classroom. And also, one parent said to me that her son asked in class during an ethnic studies course, well, what about anti-Semitism? How come that's not included? And the teacher responded angrily, that's not what this is for. So it's already in the mindset of the teachers in the classroom. They have been told what is in and what is out. And really it's flipped of what should be happening. So the parents have got to talk to their kids, have got to find out what's happening. And if you say, I'm not going to have my child in that teacher's classroom next year, if it becomes an outcry, if parents say, we're not going to take this, this is not acceptable, you cannot teach hateful information about my kids, it's the beginning. It's a way of fighting back. It's a way, they're taxpayers. It's their schools. And for so long, not just Jewish parents, so many parents have simply allowed teachers to take kids to defund the police rallies, which happened in Los Angeles, and other kinds of political rallies. They're being trained. The head of the Teachers Union in Los Angeles said she is teaching social justice warriors. That's what they're teaching. And we have to stop it. Now, the other thing that's happened because of the lawsuit, whether or not we prevail, and I have thoughts about that, but whether or not we prevail, they can no longer say they're not teaching this material, that that's not the purpose of the consortium, that the districts who are inviting this consortium into their districts, into their schools, to train their teachers, they know now. They can't say they don't know about what's really happening there and what is being brought in.
So just to take that a step further, Lori, you've shared that the consortium instructed teachers to quote unquote, I think you said in one of your articles, fly under the radar and shut their doors while teaching their Jew hatred.
Direct quote.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. So, I mean, how do we, short of, I guess, a student coming home and telling their parents, and now we're not in COVID where parents are overseeing their computers and what their kids are being taught. How do we know that these types of hateful lessons are not being unofficially taught in our public and even our private schools, which have become just as mired in dangerous wokeism, if not more so? I mean, it's my understanding, and Emmett has been, Sarah Stern and I have been talking about ways to address K through 12 curricula for a very long time. It's my understanding that in K through 12 schools across the country, there's something called the Arab World Studies Notebook that teaches lies about Israel and its treatment of its Palestinian citizens, and includes these anti-Semitic lies and tropes that you've shared. Will the Deborah Project be able to turn its attention to some of these school districts as well? I mean, we'll get into whether you prevail or don't prevail, but is lawfare the only way to deal with this?
I'm sorry, what was last?
Is lawfare really the only way to deal with this now?
Well, I do think it's helpful for parents. I see it. I've seen it in LA, and now that we filed this lawsuit, I'm getting lots of emails from parents, from teachers, from former principals, from current superintendents saying, thank you, how can we help? So there is an undercurrent of awareness and at least anxiety, if not more. But someone needs to be out front taking the steps. And it's scary to bring a lawsuit if you're not a lawyer or you don't have the kind of background where you know what the rights are and what they aren't. So I do think that it's helpful. People have already asked us to bring the lawsuit, a similar lawsuit in their school districts. So I think, it's a snowball effect. The more information comes out about what is happening, the more parents realize and taxpayers realize this is, I'm funding this to brainwash, indoctrinate my children. And, when you go after the kids, most people who otherwise won't stand up on their hind legs and fight about it, they will when it's their children. And I'm hopeful that it will go across the country, and I mean stopping this from spreading, because it has spread throughout California and it is spreading to other states. And so we have to have a nationwide revolt by the parents and the taxpayers and the teachers and say, no, this is unacceptable. We're not going to do this. Lori, earlier you asked about whether there could be punishment of some sort. And I don't think that the federal government at this time is prepared to do anything like that. But there are some administrations that are more willing to take stands. And so that's where the fights are going to have to take place in terms of the punishment for this kind of behavior, for teaching this kind of material in the schools. Now, the other thing that people have asked me is, well, you say that it has all these horrible things, and I'm willing to believe it, all these horrible things about the Jewish state, but how is that, why is that incitement against Jews? And I'm not even talking about, you know, whether you can define anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. I'm just talking about what's the spillover practically. And for people in California, they'll recall, and maybe others will recall reading about it, but last May, a year ago May, when there was the conflict in Gaza, and there was rioting in certain cities, including Los Angeles, and there were caravans of cars with Palestinian flags being waved. And in this particular instance, the caravan drove into a Jewish neighborhood in Los Angeles and stopped. The car, one of the cars stopped, and the occupants jumped out. Now, there were diners eating outside. It was a sushi restaurant. And these thugs, as they jumped out of the car and lunged towards the patrons, they said, "Who are the Jews?" They didn't say, "Who are the Israelis?" They said, "Who are the Jews?" That's dangerous. One of the parents that I spoke with said that's when he woke up. He used to think of himself as a pretty liberal kind of guy. He said, that could have been my family right there. Yeah, it could have been. That's right. So there is a lot of bleed over. As I said, the term Zionist is used as a pejorative for any Jew. It doesn't matter if you label yourself a Zionist. It's just, you know, the German Jews hid, but they were still Jews. They still suffered. I'm not saying this is the same as the Holocaust at all, but I am saying that there is a tremendous spillover and it is dangerous. Let me just say one other thing. The curriculum is not only horrible about Jews and the Jewish state, it's also awful about a lot of other people. Mainstream people, people who believe in capitalism, people who believe in heterosexuality, all kinds of permutations of American society are bad, according to this liberated curriculum. Our lawsuit is only about the Jews because that's what the Deborah Project does. We represent people who've been discriminated against in educational settings because they're Jewish or pro-Israel, and that's who our plaintiffs are. They're Jewish Zionists who believe the Jewish people have the right to a homeland and sovereignty there. So I want to be clear, it's not only hatred of the Jews, it's a hateful curriculum about a lot of what people in Western civilization believe is what we are.
You've hit on so many important points, and we've got a lot of questions in the queue. You touched on something that's near and dear to me, which is, you know, I think American Jews have turned a blind eye to the growing anti-Semitism in the country. And you concluded your Wall Street Journal column recognizing that what starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews. I mean, those weren't the words you used, but you know, I think the long-term impact, if you don't prevail, is frightening. And as you point out, we don't have a federal government right now that the education department is not focused on these types of issues as it was under the Trump administration, in particular when Ken Marcus was at the Office of Civil Rights there. So before I get to the questions, because we have so many of them in the queue, I just, you know, as we see anti-Semitism flourishing across the globe, and it's infiltrated Congress, social justice movements, corporate boardrooms, like the Ben and Jerry's boycott. And you mentioned that, you know, Jews are looked at as, you know, white supremacists, or at least enjoying white privilege. We're not an ethnicity that requires protection. So do you see a way, before I ask all the questions in the queue. Do you see any other ways that perhaps we can counter these lies that are being spoon-fed to young children, and therefore they're being brainwashed? Is there a way that we can go on the offensive and organize our own curriculum that teaches the truth about Israel and the history of the Jewish people? I mean, can we get our own people in these schools, or is that we lost that a long time ago?
No, I don't want to say that we lost it. I think we absolutely can create a wholesome, legitimate ethnic studies curriculum that pays attention to all kinds of groups and celebrates all kinds of groups, not negative about any of them, and offer that, look, to all the districts, every school district in California, every school in California is going to have ethnic studies courses. And right now, the Liberated Consortium has a monopoly. And it's hard for the principals and the superintendents to say, okay, well, we're going to create our own. It is hard, but there's an opportunity just waiting. Not just, I don't think it can just be, maybe there could be modules just on the Jewish history part. And in fact, in the model curriculum as passed by California, there is discussions about the Jewish people and Armenians and Sikhs. So it is possible to have decent, good ethnic studies courses, and there's a huge opportunity for people with knowledge of Jewish history and practice to develop these modules. So I very much welcome that. I think it should be happening. I don't understand why it hasn't happened already. And maybe an answer, of course, Lori, is that the school districts have to be open to it. And I don't know, Jews don't riot, and they don't, as a general, pretty much 97% Jews don't riot, they don't scream, they don't shout, they don't break things. And so they are ignored. And I'm not saying we need to break things and shout and hurt people at all, but we do need to stand up for ourselves, and we don't have a good history of doing that. And it's on us. It is on us. We can't just write letters to the editor and quietly, amongst ourselves, gripe about it. You have to go to the legislators. You have to be there. Believe me, CARE is friendly and has access to CARE's, the Committee on American Islamic Relations. That's what it is. And they are everywhere, and they are welcome everywhere because they make their demands known and they don't let go. They are adamant and relentless, and Jews don't do that. We need to.
So I'm going to go to the questions right now, because as I said, we do have quite a lot of them. And I think on the heels of that, someone asked an important question. Why has the Jewish community and Jewish leadership been so quiet about this in California and nationally? And why aren't they demanding Jewish studies, or at least Holocaust studies? Although I do think that many schools have adopted Holocaust studies. But where's the Jewish community in this, the organized Jewish community?
Right. Thank you for the question, because it is a very important point. And this is my theory about why they haven't been out front on this. Doesn't mean I'm right. Of course, it's my theory, so I think I'm right. The organized Jewish community, the ADLs, the federations, the JCRCs, they worked hard with the Jewish Legislative Caucus in California to fight back against the earlier model curriculum, what's now become the Liberated one. And they had a victory because it was vetoed, and the people who devised curriculum had to go, new people had to be brought in, and they created a new one. There was celebration, there was a great relief, it was a victory, there was a victory dance. Now we're saying, well, wait a minute, you didn't fix it. And no one likes to hear that. It's an uncomfortable position for anyone to admit that they prematurely rejoiced and there's still a problem. So I do think that plays a large role here, is that justification? Is it okay? No, but I don't think, I think it is human nature to have that kind of response. It's still not acceptable, but I do think that's part of what happened. I also think, that deals are made. Look, the teachers union is really powerful. I think they're the second biggest lobbying group in all of California. UTLA, the Los Angeles Teachers Union, is huge. They have a lot of influence, they have a lot of money, and they have the ability to make people listen to them. And fighting them once maybe was okay. Coming back again, saying you lied to us, not so okay for a lot of people. So I do think that that's in part why when we spoke to leaders in California, the Deborah Project, about bringing this lawsuit, we were told not to do it. It's not ripe, they said, ripe in terms of you can't bring it to court. You're going to create bad law. Well, guess what? If you wait until there are textbooks published with this material that's in this curriculum, and then you say there's a problem, it is way too late. We have heard from the educators that they are teaching this. They are teaching the only legitimate form of ethnic studies. Everything else is illegitimate. They are not going to be training people about the illegitimate form. They're doing this liberated ethnic studies. And so they're having institutes, they're bringing in teachers. They are training people along these lines. We know it's happening. Why would we wait? That's my answer, and it's
a good answer, Lori. It's really distressing. All of this is, but I'm going to try to combine a couple questions. Someone mentioned that along with ethnic studies, it seems the critical race theory in the public system is undermining Jewish student safety. The latest is race-based grading. Might action incorporate all of these woke trends, which go against logic? And the other related question is, since all of this is happening, what happens if there's no actual Jewish parents or other parents from excluded ethnicities in these kids' classrooms where the liberated curriculum is being taught? Who's going to complain about what's going on?
Okay, well, those are a couple of different things there.
Yeah.
I want to make it clear, and I haven't yet, that this consortium says flat out, I think it's still on their website as of even after we first filed the lawsuit, it was still there. They say it is critical race theory. That's the basis for what they're teaching. So they are very upfront about that. And because we've heard for the last year and a half, oh, critical race theory, that's only in law schools, that's only in graduate schools, it's not in the elementary and high schools. That's not true. These people at least admit it. It has become acceptable to have a race-focused society. How we got here from finally moving away, I don't know. I don't understand how it has become okay to give students grades, different grades based on their race, or excuse them from class because something upsetting happened. I mean, we're creating a generation of crybabies and people who need to live in plastic bubbles because that's not what the real world is like. But it has become acceptable, and in part, it's because the faculties on the campuses have been hard left for a long time. And so the education schools, graduate schools are teaching this material. They've been way ahead of us. We didn't know it was happening until now. It's reached the front. It's reached our children. People need to vote based on these issues. People need to ask their local school boards these questions. I mean, how dare the US government say that they're going to arrest parents for protesting at school? That's our school board. That's what we pay every taxpayer, even people who send their kids to private schools. They're paying for the schools. It's ours. That's where you go and make your feelings known. And if you don't, it's on you. You've allowed it. And we haven't made this a priority. And I hope that more people will feel energized to take up these questions with their school board members and say, I'm not voting for someone who thinks this is acceptable. It is not acceptable. Who doesn't write letters to the principal of their schools and say, I don't want my child being taught this. What right do you have to teach other kids to hate my child? We need to do that.
Yeah, somebody had actually pointed out in the Q&A that I'm glad you brought up the school boards, because that's, people are asking, many of these questions relate to, what can we do to push back? Somebody brought up that in their district, they're about to pay $125,000 to a new diversity, equity, and inclusion staff position, which, we've seen millions on college campuses, millions and millions of dollars on college campuses being spent on DEI, and now it's in the K through 12 curriculum. So I'm glad you brought up the school boards, because people are looking for a way to stop this. You've got to vote, as you point out.
You have to vote and you have to run. There are people who are articulate adults who should run for school board and run on this position and get people to join with you. We need more people on school boards who are prepared to say no. We don't have enough right now.
Lori, someone asked if the American Muslim community is involved in pushing this. Are they playing a role behind the scenes, or in front of, right out there?
Well, I will say that at a seminar on teaching authentic ethnic studies put on by the LA Teachers Union, their expert on Palestine is a woman from the Palestinian Youth Movement, which is a hard left entity affiliated with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Yes, and they're the experts. And she came in and she started by saying, we have to always confront Zionism. Zionism is a political colonialist settler ideology. They steal our land and our homes. We suffer. I mean, she's speaking, I love this when people say, well, that's her truth. Okay, but it's not true. Yes, there are the curriculum that is used by this consortium. They didn't develop it themselves. They got it from a site called teachpalestine.org. Where is that from? It's from the Middle East Children's Alliance, also affiliated with radical terrorist associations. That's what is being glommed onto this curriculum and brought into our schools. So I can't say that it's all certainly Muslim, even the radical Muslim American groups, and there are a lot of them, but there are absolutely infiltrations by the activist Muslim Palestinian, pro-Palestinian. They're not even necessarily from the Middle East, and they are behind this material. So yes, that was an excellent question.
Yeah. People are asking, are there no anti-racist laws here that are that they are transgressing that can be prosecuted by the state as a crime? And then sort of not the same, but somebody else, I'm just trying to combine questions to get as many in as possible. Where's the IRA definition in all this? Like, why are they, who are they to define anti-Semitism?
Well, I'm going to forget the first half, but let me just start with the last half, which is the IRA definition. This same person from the Palestinian Youth Movement, this expert, she said during her discussion that the IRA definition criminalizes criticism of Israel. So it's terrible. Well, again, completely false, but she's saying it to educators. They're leaving the room. They heard from an expert. That's truth as far as they're concerned. Are there laws? Yes, there are laws that say you can't discriminate. This one is a hard needle to thread because you have to go a couple steps. You have to get people to accept why being radically anti-Israel is anti-Semitic. Not everybody is able to get there in the first 3 notes. So you have to go through the song. And then once you get there, you have to explain, well, how does it create a dangerous environment for Jewish teachers and students? So it's not easy. And I will say, in my work at the Deborah Project, I had a lawyer for a large college laugh when I said that a student who pushed my client and said, "You Zionists, Israel has no right to exist." I said, "That's a hate crime, according to the definition of your school." And the guy laughed. It's like, that's ridiculous. No, we're not protected unless we demand it. So yes, we're covered, but you have to really make a lot of noise before anybody will recognize that.
Lori, there's a number of people that are asking how to get in touch with you. They are in California. They want to work with you. They're asking if you need pro bono assistance. I don't know if you want to put that out there, if you want people to email us.
Yeah.
So please share with everybody how they can reach you.
It's my whole name, Lori Lowenthal Marcus. It's right there on the screen, at deborahproject.org, DEBORAH project.org.
Thank you. And I'm going to get I want to get 1 or 2 more questions in before we hit the 1 o'clock stop point. People are also asking about the California legislature's guardrails, and which was supposed to stop this from happening. They apparently are ineffective. And is there anything that the legislature can do about what's happening?
Right. So the guardrails were well-written and important and good, but there's no enforcement mechanism. And if you have no enforcement mechanism, you can say whatever you want. You can say this is prohibited by law. But unless you're a law-abiding person who that's enough, that will stop you. It isn't enough. And unless these legislators start admitting that, not that they were wrong in what they did, but it didn't go far enough, or at least now they should know that there are people who are happy to disobey what you, the legislators, have said. And so you have to take further steps if you're actually committed to eradicating this dangerous and false educational material.
One final question, Lori, that I think I brought up earlier, but I don't recall whether we had answered it, and you may not know the answer to it, but a couple of people are asking, who is funding this consortium? Who's funding this Liberated curriculum? Do we know that?
Well,
I mean, you mentioned the influence of Muslim organizations, and
I don't think that's where the money is coming from. I think they're just happy to share the materials. It's good for them. Well, for one thing, it's a for-profit entity. They are selling their services. And school districts, that is, you taxpayers, are paying for it. There was one individual who was selling his advice for $1,500 an hour because he's an expert. And districts paid for it. And the Napa School District, they had last month approved a contract with very little discussion with this consortium for $30-something thousand. And I was told, I don't know if this is true, I'd love for it to be true, I don't know if it is, that once they had gotten wind of this lawsuit being in the works, the contract was rescinded. So that's good, but they do have funding. And as I said, they're the only game in town. So they are able to raise funds. Whether they sometimes charge for their institutes. So they're making money that way. Whether or not the unions are helping, I don't know. wouldn't shock me, but I do not have any proof of that.
So it's 1 o'clock and we're going to have to go. And there's so many questions I didn't get to. I apologize to everybody, but you have Lori's information now and you can reach directly out to her. Her email address is in the chat and I may put it up there. So thank you all for joining us. Lori, thank you so much. Everybody has really enjoyed this. It was so informative and your work is so critically important. So thank you for all you do. And we look forward to following it. Have a good afternoon, everyone.